And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. We're revisiting a series which I have not done an episode in this series in quite some time, but it is a series simply titled The Great Movies. And for reference, some of the films I've talked about in this series: Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, Barry Levinson's Rain Man, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. So you get an idea. I try to be at least somewhat realistic because everybody's top 10 is going to be different. Some of mine might be in your bottom 10, who knows. But tonight's episode, number 12, in the continuing series of the great movies, will be Stanley Kubrick's 1987, I believe, masterpiece, Full Metal Jacket. And not surprisingly, I did not see Full Metal Jacket in theaters. It opened in the summer of 1987, kind of duked it out with Arnold Schwarzenegger's Predator, Mel Brooks' Spaceballs, among other kind of popular films from that year and that era. I first watched Full Metal Jacket on HBO, and I was not old enough to see that film. There are certain, in my opinion, there are certain R-rated movies that it's okay if let's say a 13 or 14-year-old kid sees, at least in that era. Now it's completely different. Now, from 8 years old, you'll probably see body parts being blown up in whatever action movie you happen to have on in front of you. But there were themes, there were things that take place in Full Metal Jacket that I don't believe that I was prepared for. And film really shook me to the core. It was my father's favorite war movie. He liked Oliver Stone's Platoon. He was a big fan of, going back to the 60s, The Longest Day. And he really liked Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. But he felt that Full Metal Jacket encompassed not only the futility and the ridiculousness of Vietnam itself, but the futility of war in general and the cost on the human psyche, the human body, and the fact that it's usually 19-year-old kids of any race, any creed. They're the ones who end up getting their heads splattered all over the place. And in the world of this film, Kubrick pushes the absurdity that I just mentioned to its logical limit in a pretty terrifying concluding sequence involving a sniper. But Full Metal Jacket is broken up into three components. The last component being the sequence with the sniper. The middle component showing the kind of chaos and insanity of Vietnam from the perspective of the United States, as Matthew Modine's principal character, in the book, his name is Davis. The book was written by a guy named Gustav Hasford. It was not called Full Metal Jacket. The book was called The Short Timers. And the middle segment follows Private Joker. He's only known as Joker. He's a photojournalist, and he is kind of, while being in combat, he is reporting on the war and sending dispatches back home. The idea being, we need to win the hearts and minds of American citizens. Now, I believe very strongly that if what you are doing as a nation at war, if the American people believe that what you are doing is just, you don't need to trick them into supporting it. If what you are doing is just, if they can make sense of it, it's good enough. Do we think it was an accident that after Pearl Harbor, so many young Americans, including members of my family, and I'd be willing to bet members of yours as well, enlisted? Now, both of my uncles who enlisted, one of whom was married. It was that important. No one needed to talk him into it. He volunteered. Now, what we saw with Vietnam, There were some volunteers, but there were always going to be certain people in the military because we had a peacetime draft. It's so crazy to imagine in America where there was always a military draft. So this is one of the things you can toss at somebody when they talk about how we have less freedoms now. No, no, you don't. Anyone under 30 who says that we are less free now than we were when in my father's day, grandfather, no, you have no idea. Because people like my dad, well, not so much him specifically, because he was an academic and he graduated high school early, but there were people 18 years old who were not enrolled in college that knew there was a chance they were going to have to spend 2 years of their lives in the military, even during peacetime. There was that level of conscription where you didn't really have a choice. Not even really, you didn't have a choice. So that's something that the film does not really get into, but it was mostly not a volunteer war effort in Vietnam. And the reason why that was is because nobody could make sense of what we were doing there. And this film, in the middle segments, gets into that Private Joker is trying to frame stories a certain way, or should I say this or should I say that? And he's very sarcastic. He's kind of a dick, but we get where he's coming from. He doesn't so much say, what are we doing here? But he says, why? Well, because we have to win over the hearts and minds, regardless of whether they believe we are getting anywhere or we are doing anything worth the lives of how many Americans? More than 50,000? And so many hundreds of thousands gravely wounded, permanently impaired? There is a reason why this war became very unpopular. It became very unpopular because not only could people not understand why we were over there, but no one likes to see young men return home in body bags or return home missing limbs. Doesn't make it good, people who died in World War II. Doesn't make it okay. But you understand. And here, it was almost impossible to understand. The chaos and the fright and the terror that the soldiers feel, regardless of whether they think we're doing the right thing or not, that part is colorblind, if you'll pardon the expression. Because when you're in war, as Kubrick very clearly points out, your next step could be your last. Doesn't play any favorites. Some people get lucky and some people don't. And so the middle sections are when you get into the kind of political arena. We're not beaten over the head with John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon. We don't really get into any of that. But we get the idea that regardless of what we feel about why we're here and we have to make shit up so that it looks better than it actually is. And it's not something that I would have thought about as a kid. I knew that Vietnam, in broad strokes, had been a disaster, had been a clusterfuck. But it took this movie and maybe a little bit of reading, a little bit of following up, to understand it was a lot worse than I thought. Because as difficult as it is to serve, to know that you may not come home, is it going to hurt if I die? All of these things 18, 19-year-old men were dealing with. To not believe in what you're doing? To know that your next step could be your last? It's too horrifying to contemplate. And as a kid watching it, didn't hit the same way as it would now, as it does now. And one thing with Stanley Kubrick is he was always... Great filmmakers have certain preoccupations. This is not anything new. Steven Spielberg, a lot of his movies deal with the breakdown of the nuclear family. They deal with a boy searching for a parent or parents or searching for his mom. He came from a broken home. That was not a coincidence. Martin Scorsese, a lot of his classic films, whether it's Mean Streets, whether it's Goodfellas, in a cockeyed way, age of innocence. They deal with notions of Catholic guilt, notions of guilt in general, and social structure. It could be the mafia. It could be the rich people in New York in the latter part of the 19th century. Those are his obsessions. Stanley Kubrick was obsessed with technology taking over and dehumanization. And all of this negative stuff that I just mentioned about people who were in Vietnam, as represented by Matthew Modine's Private Joker in particular, and also the character, a fellow photojournalist, Rafterman, and the actor John Terry, who was terrific. He actually played Felix Leiter in my favorite James Bond film, The Living Daylights. I don't remember the name of his character in Full Metal Jacket, but he's the guy when they're over there and they're not facing active combat. He's the guy who Matthew Modine is reporting to literally, and he's going to send the dispatches back home, whatever the technology was, right around the time of the Tet Offensive. The idea of dehumanization, the more you think about it, the more terrifying it is. And in the world of this film, the opening 45 minutes of the movie is what people remember most. And there were plenty of critics. Nobody said that the opening stanza of the film, the boot camp sequence, was not extraordinary. I would say that it is the best 45 minutes of film that I have ever seen. Like, just consecutive. Forget the best thing that Kubrick ever did for that stretch. Nobody's ever approached it. You can give me any filmmaker ever. Nobody has ever done what Kubrick did and does in the first 45 minutes of this film. We see these young men, all stripes, all shapes and sizes, all creeds, presumably all different religions. They're all very young, and they're in Paris Island. They're at boot camp. And in order to become actual soldiers, in some cases, they're just going to be cannon fodder to get blown up by the enemy, to get shot dead by people they can't see, because we're in their territory. They know how to use camouflage. We're just invaders, quite frankly. But the character played by the late R. Lee Ermey, who was a real-life drill instructor, who only got the role because the individual, the gentleman that Stanley Kubrick cast as Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, Tim Colcheri got sick. Lee Ermey, R. Lee Ermey or Lee Ermey, he went by both in various films. He was a technical advisor. And when Colcheri turned up sick, Stanley Kubrick was a guy who, on his time, he might do 300 takes of a 5-second setup, but he did not want you to waste his time. So when Colcheri turned up sick, Kubrick was noticing the fact that Ermey could shout insults at people without notes for 20 minutes straight. And he said, you know what? I'll find another role for Tim. You're going to play this part. And I hate to say it for Tim Colcheri, but cinema is grateful that he turned up sick and R. Lee Ermey ended up playing Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. How he didn't get a Best Supporting Actor Oscar, forget nomination, a Best Supporting Actor Oscar, I do not know these things. He is extraordinary times 10. It's one of the best supporting performances in the history of cinema, in the greatest sequence of film in the history of cinema. But his character is there not just to get the soldiers acclimatized, to get them up to speed of what it is going to be like when you go over there. He wants to strip them of their humanity. And this is where you get into the Kubrick angle of the computer I almost said A Clockwork Orange. The computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey has more human qualities than the astronauts. In this film, the goal of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman is to dehumanize the soldiers to the point where they are literally nothing if they don't have a rifle in their hands or a bayonet that they could stick into the lungs of the Viet Cong. That's all they're good for. And I don't believe that this movie is being overly cynical. Unfortunately, in war, it can just become a numbers game Do we have numbers on them? Do we have an advantage in manpower? Can we see the enemy? All of these threads that are dropped in the beginning, they all pay off in that concluding sequence with the sniper. Everything I just said, the more you think about it, the more you run this movie through the mental meat grinder, the worse it looks, the worse this war feels, and the sadder war itself is. And Oliver Stone's Platoon gets into the futility of war, but it doesn't do it in the same fashion. That's more of what you would call a combat film. That movie also is more obvious with its representations of good and evil. Full Metal Jacket, I feel like, is more realistic. That's why I love Oliver Stone as a filmmaker. I mean, some of the wacky stuff that he's said over the years, but as a filmmaker, Oliver Stone is a master craftsman. He's not quite on the level, in my opinion, Spielberg, Coppola, Lucas, or maybe Lucas, Spielberg, Coppola, Scorsese, but he's very close. When it comes to the technical proficiency, he doesn't have to take a backseat to any of them, but Stone has made some movies that just not worthy of his talent, is how I would say it. But what he did in Platoon was he made a more straightforward Vietnam War film. Go back to the 70s and Michael Cimino with The Deer Hunter, which was the first large-scale Hollywood production that dealt in any way with Vietnam. That's not really a very good depiction of Vietnam. Vietnam is merely a backdrop. Apocalypse Now, same kind of thing. It's not really a good representation of the Vietnam War. Stone was able to do and give us the horror of war, but the themes are a little bit too simplistic. For those who remember, the Tom Berenger character and the Willem Dafoe character, it's pretty stark, bad guy, good guy. And then Charlie Sheen as the kind of open-faced, the character who was supposed to represent the real Oliver Stone, who went through most of these horrendous experiences. This was a very personal story for him, no doubt about it. He wrote the script, and a lot of it was based on his own awful experiences in Vietnam. But the fact that Kubrick does not give us any kind of a conventional hero or villain structure, he doesn't even have characters that you can count on. They're going to be good the whole way through. They're going to be bad the whole way through. The actors in this movie are all great. Now, Adam Baldwin, who's not related to, Alec, Billy, and Steven, or, Daniel, but Adam Baldwin, who, if you remember, about 10 years later in Independence Day, he plays the military guy who knows about Area 51, who brings, Bill Pullman's President Whitmore into the fold, and he actually gets to shoot the glass when the doctor is he's almost being force choked by the alien in that famous sequence. But his character in this film of Animal Mother, we only meet him in this sequence, which, as I said, leads to just a horrendous encounter with a sniper. But Animal Mother is the perfect soldier. He is better than anybody that we saw in the boot camp sequence, and the two characters we follow most closely there and then somewhat forward, Matthew Modine's Private Joker and Arliss Howard's Private Cowboy. We don't get his name at all in the film. He's just called Cowboy. And we see them, and Private Joker is, if he's not the best soldier to come out of the barracks, he's close. He's a good athlete. He takes direction well, and if he's scared shitless, he comes across like a guy who is not going to buckle under pressure. Now, sometimes, as we found out years later in Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, sometimes your gun just doesn't work properly. Sometimes your gun is going to jam at the worst possible time. And if that costs you your life, well, unfortunately, it feels like it was just meant to be. The character of Animal Mother, though, the Adam Baldwin character in this film, is a perfect soldier. Put it in quotes. He's not really a perfect soldier. But in the world of this movie, the way that Kubrick sets this up, the way we see as the audience the dehumanization of all of these young men, this is the end result. This is a guy who is fearless, and he exists only because he has bullets in his gun, and he is going to pump as many rounds as possible at the enemy until his lungs cannot draw any more breath because somebody maybe shot him 6 times. It's an incredible performance by Adam Baldwin, who played a lot of heavies after this. It was good to see him in Independence Day in a more, in a good guy sort of role because, man, he's played a lot of villains, a lot of bad guys, because he's a very menacing, very kind of intimidating actor, and this movie gets into that. The way that his character relates to Joker also feels real, because you can have people who are antagonistic, that their sense is, I don't like this guy, but doesn't mean you're going to go out of your way to kill them. That's something that Platoon gets into. But this movie, to me, is more believable. Guys can have beef. They can have legitimate philosophical problems. It doesn't mean they're going to turn a gun on each other. Doesn't mean they're going to turn a gun on each other. And the way this movie wraps up, it all feels believable based on what we've seen. Now, Full Metal Jacket was not really that polarizing of a film. And when I use the word polarizing, I mean that you're going to find people here and people there. You could do that with almost any film. This movie had plenty of people that would have put it in their all-time top 10, well, for sure top 10, but top 5, top 3 war movies. There was disagreement among many major critics. Pauline Kael was not a fan, if memory serves. I think that, although she didn't really give a star rating, she wrote for The New Yorker. She just wrote these long essays on movies. And David Denby, who later wrote for The New Yorker, but he wrote for New York Magazine when I subscribed to it, and his columns, he's almost as good as Ebert as far as I'm concerned. But then he ended up going to work for The New Yorker. But Pauline Kael didn't like Full Metal Jacket. And when Siskel and Ebert reviewed it, this is something you can check out on YouTube. It's one of their best arguments. Gene Siskel was blown away by Full Metal Jacket. He had it up there with A Clockwork Orange, with 2001. He absolutely loved Full Metal Jacket. Roger was just, I don't even know if Roger gave it a thumbs up. I think he gave it a marginal thumbs up, but he gave it 2.5 stars out of 4. Now, it's not that much different, well, a little bit different, than when Gene thought that Blue Velvet was one of the best movies of its kind, one of the best psychological thrillers since Psycho. And Roger, forget 2.5 stars, Roger gave Blue Velvet 1 star. He thought it was atrociously bad, and he was angry at David Lynch for making that movie the way that he did. Yeah, that was really great, the way they yelled at each other over that. But Full Metal Jacket, Siskel thought was a masterpiece. Ebert was very lukewarm on it. So you could tell that Stanley hasn't lost it. He's incredibly talented. This film has unbelievable power and moments. It kind of left me a little bit cold. Now, if you go on Rotten Tomatoes, Full Metal Jacket is at 90%. So 9 out of 10 critics, or 9 out of 10 of the reviews collected, is giving the film a thumbs up. Now, there are Oscar winners that are in the high 80s. So this is a film that on the whole, most people say you got to see it. This is the kind of film, though, as a Gen Xer, we were all bombarded with it on HBO, on Cinemax, especially the fact, I think that Cinemax, they were allowed to show rated R movies when it was not 8 p.m. They could show it at different hours of the day, whereas HBO had that thing that they kept. They didn't show R-rated movies except between the hours of like 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. or something weird like that. But Full Metal Jacket is a film I've seen at least 15 times, start to finish. It is so beautifully shot. There are individual just frames where there is so much detail. Kubrick crams so much visual information into almost every frame. It's one of the reasons, presumably, why he did so many takes. He was always asking himself, and Ridley Scott talked about this during the making of Blade Runner. The goal is to put as much information into every single shot, either visually in the sense of, oh, what's that over there? Look at that. There's somebody who's walking a dog behind these guys, whatever. Or just information like, you watch this movie and you look at the flyers on the wall, and you say, I wonder if they made flyers just for this. Yeah, they did. That's the kind of perfectionist that Kubrick is. The scene where Hartman comes in and starts talking about today is Christmas. There's all kinds of flyers on the wall. And if you zoom in, if you look closely, they all have to do with what it's supposed to have to. This isn't one of those where you have a headline and then below it, the text has nothing to do with it, where it's just bullshit. Every inch of this movie, Kubrick put 100% of himself. He could not have given more. And I don't know what his thoughts were as far as, did he think the critics maybe missed the boat? Because not every critic, Roger Ebert also didn't get A Clockwork Orange. He never got A Clockwork Orange till the day he died. I saw Ebert a few years before he got sick at Rockefeller University. Boy, what a great speaker he was. Ebert was so good. He could have been a stand up comic. He was unbelievable, just as somebody engaging the audience as he was taking questions. It was a part of his book tour when he wrote, I hated this movie. The book was a riot. But Ebert did not like A Clockwork Orange. He was an enormous fan of 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think he would have considered that to be Kubrick's best film. I don't know what he thought of Barry Lyndon. Barry Lyndon, I don't really, I mean, I can appreciate the grandeur and the majesty of it, but I'm not really a fan. But Full Metal Jacket is one of those films. If you go on YouTube now and you look at many of the movie reactors, whether it's Popcorn in Bed or Reelin' with Asia and BJ, the main movie reactors, the people that are presumably pulling in millions of dollars a year just to react to movies and or music, they all hit the ceiling with this film. Even if it was not enjoyable, this is not an enjoyable, it's not a fun movie, even though there's a ton of quotable lines, particularly in the boot camp sequence. But this is a powerful film. It is a film that really makes you think and wonder, what if they gave a war and no one got there, right? What if they gave a war and no one came? What if they gave a war and people just said, fuck this? Well, that's never going to happen. But Vietnam was intensely, easily avoidable. We got involved, and so many people paid the ultimate price. We didn't even have a clear objective. All of this awful stuff is in this movie. Some of it is implied, but the sum total, everything adds up to how truly terrible this war was. And I understand, and I know firsthand, Hollywood is a lot of horseshit. There are a lot of pure cash grabs and movies that only exist to entertain and make money, which is fine. But sometimes Hollywood, the best of Hollywood, enriches us. It shines a light on not just events, but on certain aspects of those events that we may not have thought of otherwise. And that, to me, is the greatest gift that Stanley Kubrick and this film gives to us. It's the understanding. It's not just broad strokes Vietnam bad. It's why it was so bad. And hopefully, lessons that people could learn and understand not to repeat the same mistakes that we as a country made all those years ago. We shouldn't have to sell it to the American people. They're smart enough to know if something is bad or if something is worthwhile. We saw it in World War II, and much later, after 9/11, we saw it in the immediate jump in enrollment into the military. It's not an accident. We're not stupid. Americans on the whole are not stupid. We do stupid things, yes, of course. If a war is just, people will show up. I've always believed that. Now, my father was someone who was drafted. He was drafted before Vietnam escalated. He did not see any combat. He was kept stateside. Dad was already a college graduate. He was already a CPA. A very young man, but he was already a CPA. He had the most value in the finance office. Now, the sad thing, and I'm going to close on this, just showing how the inanity of it and how cruel things can be. A gentleman that my father was in basic training with. Dad never left Fort Jackson. He was at Fort Jackson for basic, and then he stayed there working in the finance office. But one of the guys, a fellow CPA, he had a little bit more time than Dad. Dad was a short timer when Vietnam escalated, and someone like him theoretically could have gone, but he didn't have enough time left. They were not going to send him over there anyway, even if they were desperate. Somebody still has to balance the books in the military. It's like ridiculous, but it's true. Someone that he knew from the beginning was sent over there, I think, just before the escalation. So he was working not far from the contested space. And he was in, it was a normal office. The enemy blew it up. He technically died in combat, even though he had a pencil in his hand. That's the futility of war. People who have nothing to do with the fight. In that case, The mistake was, well, I guess he was in the army and he got sent over there, but he wasn't fighting anybody. He had a pencil in his hand. That's how he died. Killed in action. He's one of the tens of thousands of American soldiers who died in that terrible conflict. But Full Metal Jacket, to me, is a great film. And if I'm asked the question, what do I think are Stanley Kubrick's 3 best films, not in any order, I'm always going to say 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket. Those are an easy 3. And I have Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket as kind of 1 and 1A. A Clockwork Orange, I think, is Kubrick's, I think it's his finest achievement. It's beyond extraordinary. I'm sorry Roger Ebert never liked it, because I love Roger Ebert. But Kubrick's films weren't for everyone. His last movie, Eyes Wide Shut, I like more now than when I saw it in theaters 25 and a half years ago. I was a little bit disappointed, but watching it a few times since then, no, this movie's great. It's not as good as Full Metal Jacket or A Clockwork Orange or 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think it's on par with The Shining, a movie I like but I don't love. But that's a story for another day. Stanley Kubrick's 1987 Vietnam War epic? We'll use the word epic. Full Metal Jacket, the 12th entry in our continuing series of the great movies. This has been episode 407 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening. Sorry I get a little geared up when talking about this, because any of you who have family who were soldiers, hopefully you didn't lose anybody, but it's just unfortunately just a part of life, right? But if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.